Doctor, what's up?
Just living the dream, Casey. Living the dream.
Love it. Love it. Exciting stuff today. I'm going to dive into some pelvic discussion. So we have looked at our kinematic sequence, now identified as coaches that our athlete has a pelvis timing or pelvis velocity issue. Basically, looking at that time sequence in our kinematic sequence and saying this pelvis doesn't look right. Let's talk about kind of what pelvic rotation is today. I know the first place we're going to start is defining it. So do you have a working definition for pelvis rotation?
Pelvis rotation is basically the orientation of your hips with respect to that target. And that's what our working definition is during the pitching motion.
Perfect. Now, moving into some of the stuff that's pre-written, you and I talked about a little bit, how other researchers out there have kind of looked into this space. We know there's some awareness issues in younger athletes of the pelvis. There's been a ton written on that. What did you find on research that currently exists around pelvic rotation?
Yeah, I mean, pelvis rotation is such a often discussed thing amongst coaches and players. But in our research findings, you actually see that a lot of youth athletes, they actually rotate their pelvis faster than major league athletes. So when you're looking at pelvis rotation, I think it's really important to look at it in the context of that's the gateway of transferring the energy from the ground, from your ground reaction forces, and that's coming off the mound as well as into your foot plant. And it's that gateway of transferring that energy from your lower extremities up the kinetic chain and really getting things started. So it's not so much about, hey, let's rotate this faster, or the better athletes rotate their pelvis faster than the worse athletes or the younger athletes. It's really about getting it into a good position to do that energy transfer and sending that momentum up the kinetic chain.
That's great. Do you have any information from the Pro Play data set and any kind of visuals, hint, on what this looks like and kind of break this down a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we can get a little bit getting into some of the research here. So
Yes.
from the Kinetic Pro data set at foot plant, we're looking at around 40 to 45 degrees of hip to shoulder separation at that instant of foot plant. Now, at the same time, what we are looking for is a good amount of pelvis rotation there. Now, what we know about pelvis rotation is that if you are rotating that pelvis early in the delivery, uh, you're going to have less ball velocity. If you are having poor timing between that pelvis and the trunk, that's decreased ball velocity. If you're late in rotating that pelvis, that's something that is going to lead to increased forces on the shoulder and the elbow. And poor timing between those two, you're also going to see that. So what we found with like the Kinetic Pro data set is that our low velocity guys, which are still pretty high velocity guys, all the way up to our very high velocity athletes, they all are pretty comparable in terms of their amount of pelvis twist. But when we start diving into it a little bit closer, what we start to understand is that your pelvis position and your pelvis velocity peaks. A lot of this can be related back to mobility issues. If you don't have that mobility to get that pelvis into the right position, your hip to shoulder separation doesn't necessarily matter so much. So we all fixate on hip to shoulder separation, but if that pelvis isn't in a good position to receive that energy, then you're kind of wasting it. And this is a little bit of an example just to kind of explain what's happening with the pelvis position. So what we have here is, a top-down view of the pelvis. The right side of the screen would be the direction of home plate. And this green arrow is the energy that's being transferred from the ground into the femur. And this is our anatomical femur here in this document. So if the pelvis is too closed, meaning you're facing third base as a right-hand pitcher in that case, you can see that energy is going to get transferred through the femur, and it basically just hits a wall, and that wall is your pelvis. It doesn't cause any form of rotation. So you're not able to get that good energy transfer and move that momentum up. Now, counter to that, if you're too open, what you're going to see is there's not enough space. And we were talking about this before. Pitching is about creating space and then rapidly closing that space in the proper time. So if you're too open into foot plant, this is what you're going to see. You're not able to transfer that energy very effectively. You can see there's, this curved line here is the amount of space we have to rotate, and there just isn't a whole lot. But in that kind of Goldilocks just right situation, when we're seeing that roughly 43 to 48 degrees of pelvis twist into foot plant, we're able to transfer that energy into the pelvis. That pelvis is able to close that space very rapidly and rotate. And like I said, that's that gateway to transferring that momentum up the kinetic chain and really to delivering the ball at a very high velocity.
So we talk about the kinetic sequence. We talk about foot plant. Obviously, this is occurring kind of just after foot plant here. We're talking about the lead leg's impact a little bit on that rotation. When we talk about kind of more elite level throwers versus maybe non-elite level throwers, how do we evaluate that timing, and what should we be looking for? Kind of maybe some examples here. It looks like we've got one of our guys here, one of our more elite guys. What are some examples and kind of real cases of what we'd be looking for here?
Yeah, so I mean, you're seeing with the master here, he's getting his pelvis into a really good position to accept that energy from the lead leg. And I'm going to jump one slide ahead here just to show this. Now you can see with the gray line, that's our athlete who's kind of got that just right position, what we were talking about. And in this case, he's around that 43 degrees of pelvis rotation. He's got his hip to shoulder separation around 45 degrees at that point there. And the one in the green line, you can see that's a little bit closer to maybe like 20 degrees or so. So that pelvis is still fairly closed, and it's just not putting him in a position to accept that momentum and transfer it up the chain at that point.
So I think a lot of times it comes down to, when we as coaches, we're looking at teaching this, right? And we talk about, what impacts the pelvis. And I get that question a lot. I think it comes down to two things that I've really kind of been out in our time, with Kinetic Pro teaching guys. And Mike, your thoughts on this are kind of what I'm after. But, we've assessed guys, and we've seen physically there's some major limitations, just like the research document that you pointed out there. There's definitely some issues with guys when we look at a physicality side of things, whether it be pelvic awareness. In this case, we have this green line, an athlete who's maybe a little bit younger, maybe doesn't have quite all of that pelvic awareness built up yet, or just a sheer mobility issue in some cases for guys where they're just not able to actually put themselves in that position. As coaches, I think a lot of times we want to make this about a drill, right? A throwing drill. And we try to make it, your back leg doesn't work well enough and we need to rotate more. We need to get more eversion out of the back foot. And that's going to, rotate. I think all of that has relevance. Absolutely. But if we're not checking the boxes off, right, on the assessment side of it, then it sounds like here, regardless, we're just not going to set ourselves up for success here. This is really not something that I can control so much as a coach, especially during the pitching motion. This is something that is probably more controlled and more built from a physicality side. Would you agree on that?
I would agree completely. And I'm just letting this kind of roll out here so you can see another good example of what we're talking about, from three different angles. And our paused frame that you see right there in the middle, that I'm going to zoom in on here, this is an example of that high level thrower. And you can see exactly what we're talking about. We've got that femur going right into the pelvis. We've got that good positioning and good hip to shoulder separation. I think it's very difficult, like you were saying, to say, okay, let's coach your pelvis position. That's definitely not what you want to be doing. And I think that falls into line of, you try to coach your mechanics off the mound and in the weight room, right?
So my other question for you, Mike, on this is, a lot of times the coaching cue has been to rotate your pelvis as fast as possible. And it's like an active rotation of the pelvis that coaches are trying to teach, whether it be with a modality like a device, or whether it be just, I think we've seen the videos of, I think it was a quarterback who was just like, ripping his pelvis open, going down the field and like trying to feel that rotation, right? Not saying that either of those things are right or wrong. Maybe it helps somebody feel something and maybe get there. But in terms of overall practicality and overall development, it sounds like from the physical side of things, that's what we really have to develop our athlete. Maybe not so much on the active side. Maybe this is more passive in its movement. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think absolutely would.
Awesome. So moving into the kind of close of this in terms of pelvic rotation, when we are, to kind of summarize here of what we brought up here, when we're trying to teach athletes, we're kind of looking for on our ProPlay data set, on our ProPlay analysis, we're trying to look for somewhere around foot plant for our athlete to be around that 45 degree to 60 degree range. Is that the right range there?
Yep, I'd say that's even in that 40 to 50 degree range, I think you're likely all right in that space.
Excellent. So if we're not seeing our athletes there, I think the easiest way, and what we've seen so far in terms of making adjustments, the easiest way is to really look into the strength conditioning side of things, to implement some drill work, maybe applied some things that we'll talk about in our written formats and Connect. And maybe from there, we start to see change over time. But I think one of the things, Mike, that you and I have talked so much about that I really think we just continue to keep coming back to is if we're going to make a mechanical change, you got to have a really good reason to make a mechanical change, right? And
Absolutely.
in this case, I think if we see that somebody's pelvis is maybe not in the right rotation, especially at a younger age, like that 14-year-old range, right? That 13-year-old range, it's really easy for us to jump to the analysis as coaches to try to make changes in drill work. But in reality, it could be a maturity thing. It could be a strength conditioning thing. And we need to be able to analyze that, be able to create a system that supports that. From our end with Connect, we're trying to build this predictive model, and our goal is to try to take these key components like this and direct them somewhere into the future through our software. But something that I think that you and I have talked so much about, and we just keep coming back to, is we have to have really good reasons to make mechanical changes. And I think this is just another great example of there's so much that can go wrong trying to fix it if you're trying to fix it the wrong way. But there is so much that can go right and so much that can be beneficial if you understand that course of time and understand kind of the long-term focus and goals, and something that ProPlay allows us to do. It allows us to continue to reassess effectively week over week, day over day, month over month to see that change. So really excited here. Mike, you have anything to close on pelvis rotation?
Just the pelvis rotation after the lead leg block. That was a little.
Ouch. Love it. That's great. Well, good. Next, we'll be shooting over to lead leg, talk a little bit more about lead leg, and then close out our pelvis segment. We'll be talking about hip shoulder separation a little bit. So appreciate time as always, Mike. Talk to you on the next episode.
All right. Hit him straight, Casey.
Thanks.